and thanks for everybody for coming. I mean, you probably have better things to do, but anyhow. See, this is ideally I should have talked about things I know better, which is a boring discipline called sociology. But here it's something different, and but something that I find personally important. Right? So one is I don't consider myself a poet, but I dabble in poetry, in Sinhala mostly, and sometimes in English. In the same way, I also dabble in photography when I have the time and when I'm in the mood. Right? The latter does not make me a photographer too, in the same way that dabbling in poetry does not make me a poet. Both being a poet and photographer often comes from self-perceptions of what one is, as well as societal attributions of us, what other people think of us, right? In my case, social acceptance of me is as a sociologist, which is also my training. Given this seeming disclaimer, you may wonder where the word poet in the title of this presentation comes from and what am I up to. It comes from a former PhD student of mine, Dr. Pooja Kalita, who's right here. When she suggested the title, I recognized its trajectory from the foreword she wrote for my English language poetry collection, Let Us Be Silent. In her foreword, called Demystifying the Poet Within the Quintessential Sociologist, Pooja makes the following observations, and I quote her. I have had the privilege of knowing the poetic sociologist and the teacher he has been. Sasanka Perera would not enter a classroom armed with academic jargon, but rather would be accompanied by poetic imagination that ranged from the mundane show of buying groceries to the consequence of imperialism to Buddhist philosophy. Now, of course, Pooja is often quite biased in my favor, as this might also sound, but nevertheless, this is a reference through the metaphor of poetry to creativity in teaching, right? That's what she's trying to say. She later refers more directly to poetry itself, and I quote Pooja again. His poetry is not simply in a separate domain from his academic methodological inclinations, but something that enriches each other. In other words, the sociologist exists because of the poetry and vice versa. Now, this is not a conventional review of poetry, but a methodological reflection of poetry in the hands of an academic. In a sense, what Pooja has done is to offer a reading of me as someone who engages in poetry as an alter ego within my academic persona. More importantly, it offers an apt opening to what I want to say today. Let me make two very basic points. One, I think teachers at university level or even at schools, very nice to see you, Santosh. Teacher, before she disturbed me, I think teachers at university level or even in schools need to be creative and subtle in the way they teach and write. Much of this depends on how they handle language. They need to know what languages should be used in what context. Now, if I was speaking at Malini Fonseca's funeral yesterday, I would not have made the speech that my friend Soumya Lianagate did. That's what I'm talking about, right? Now, that kind of specificity in language cannot come unless one engages with creative writing that vary from poetry to forms of fiction. I do not mean these kinds of people, colleagues who teach and so on, have to be able to write fiction or poetry. But they certainly and ideally need to read and immerse themselves in creative forms of expression. If not, I'm afraid, the likelihood of them becoming dry and colorless is significant. There is no contradiction as far as I can see in being a scholar and poet, or in being an academic in any discipline in the sciences or social sciences, and being deeply interested in creative writing. In fact, this would be extremely beneficial to both life and work. This is what I believe, and this is what I have experienced. But I will not indulge in this idea that much today unless it comes up in our conversation. Two, and I'll pose this as a question, can forms of creative expression be considered reliable repositories of information and a method in social research and writing in a time overdetermined by clinical understandings of objectivity and statistics as ultimate social facts? That is, can creative material be seen as research and as a means of writing? I want to address this aspect in some detail today, which is what I am going to do now. So when I say it takes two to tango, this is for you, Priyanti, right? Priyanti has brought the music as well today. So after this we'll dance. So when I say it takes two to tango, I mean the ideal for teaching, research and writing in my kind of field for sure, and perhaps in other areas too, should incorporate both research in the conventional sense and creative output such as poetry and fiction on the other hand. For me, these are complementary and workable binary opposites and not contradictions. The tango between these two forms gives our work more color and dynamism. Now, let me explore the question, can forms of creative expression be considered reliable repositories of information and methods in social research? So this is the main thing that I want to talk about today. When think about combining academic and creative enterprises, an opinion attributed to sociologist Howard Becker comes to mind. He noted, and I quote, "Creative acts emerge within the social context where individuals and cultural dynamics intertwine to produce innovative expressions." In the same sense, I guess it is self-evident, academic acts also emerge from within the social. So, something combining these acts at different levels in society should not be as inconceivable as it often sounds. But methodologically, it is precisely this idea of innovativeness that creates anxieties for mainstream social sciences. Like the word terrorism that brings fear and anxiety to military establishments and governments across the world, innovativeness brings similar anxieties and fears to established academic disciplines in social sciences across the world too. And this is particularly the case with mainstream sociology, which is my discipline, and which is why I am utterly bored with sociology in Sri Lanka in particular, but sociology in this part of the world more generally. This is because innovativeness effectively translates into subjective in this context, and anything and everything that is not supposedly objective in a black and white sense is taboo from mainstream consideration. This is similar to what Patricia Levy has pointed out in her book, Method Meets Arts, arts-based research practice, where she notes that mainstream qualitative research often followed strict disciplinary standards regarding methodological choices, at times seemingly judged against positivist standards, right? So if something is not statistically sound, it's not scientific. This means, historically, social sciences have attempted to create their so-called scientific persona by institutionalizing and blindly codifying what is thought to be objectivity as mandated by natural sciences. This has been further strengthened by social sciences' relentless and often non-reflective pursuit of statistics and quantification in general. Personally, I have always had a problem with our disciplines, including mine, considering too narrowly the idea of objectivity and scientificity in the same way sciences do when trying to understand such an utterly non-objective and emotional species as the humans, right? It is in this context that social sciences have by and large, not considered creative expressions reflectively in theoretical, methodological, and pedagogical terms, barring the efforts of a relatively small community of scholars. Let me now specifically focus on creative expressions in social research. When we are talking of creative expressions, there is a fundamental distinction that can be made. That is, one, are we thinking of creative expressions in the way we present our work as forms of text, or two, are we thinking of creative expressions in the way we present our work, are we thinking of creative expressions as sources of information for our research? These two are very distinct domains that we need to keep in mind. There is also another distinction that is useful to make, and that is, one, are we talking of creative material generated as part of research, or two, are we referring to creative expressions that already exist in society which may focus on as part of the research process? Today, much of the scholarly attention on what is called arts-based research focuses on the way we present our work as forms of text and creative material generated as part of the research process itself. So what people call arts-based research comes from the research process itself. It doesn't exist outside independently. Today, so what is known as social fiction, and this word is important, has emerged in situations where forms of fiction have been created as part of the research process itself. Patricia Levy, who coined the word, identifies social fiction as works of fiction that is grounded in scholarly research. That is, fiction generated as part of a research process to talk about social issues fictionally. Levy's first novel, Low-Fat Love, was based on insights from a decade of interview research and autoethnographic observations. So she's written a novel, but the material came from serious ethnographic research. This is the difference. And I see, if I may digress a little bit, I think that, see, Sri Lankan writer once called me in India a few years ago, and I was on my way traveling to Bhutan. And he said, sir, now, he wanted to talk about the Japanese bombing of Colombo. There was that little incident, 1940, whatever. So then I asked him, are you writing a novel? He said, yes. So I said, see, this is not the way to do this. I am on the way to Bhutan and you are asking me about Japanese bombing of Colombo, which happened so long ago. You are supposed to be in the archives looking at. That is the kind of thing that I am talking about. Now this guy is trained as a social scientist. He should have done the research without asking me, right? In other words, I think even a fairly good novel will be extremely dynamic and believable even in fictional form if you allow research to do the trick. Now, this is why I am fascinated with works of people like Umberto Eco. Now, obviously, his philosophy and his scholarly interest in linguistics as well as in European history comes out very clearly from his first novel to the last, right? Without that scholarly background, he wouldn't have written any of these things, right? So this is what I'm trying to say. So even if we are looking only at fiction and fiction for the sake of fiction, I think research has to go into this. But I'm talking about something in between. I'm talking about whether these works of fiction can impact the way we teach and the way we write. So I'll come to this in a bit. I'm going back to Patricia Levy because she is one of these people who's talked quite a lot about this use of fiction in sociology in particular. In a 2022 interview, she noted, writing fiction sensitizes you to the world in new ways that permeates everything. I think it's made me a much stronger sociologist. I am able to see more connections, macro links and their nuances. I think both more broadly and with far more specificity. I use language more precisely, which not only changes the way I write, but also the way I read and the way I hear. So this is what Levy is talking about fiction. I think she's right. My personal engagement with photography and poetry, as well as interest in language as a tool for popular communication, have made me more attuned to details and nuances in the landscapes and humanscapes, as well as the emotional and linguistic domains I tread upon in my research, reading and thinking. Here, for Levy, as it is for many others, social fiction is not only a method of research, but also a way of expression rooted via mediations in language. As we noted in 2015, academic articles published in usual forums are hardly read except by a handful of experts, and they are inaccessible in terms of language. Now we know all about this, right? For her, in this specific context, social fiction was a matter of finding a different way to conduct and present research. So she had these two things. It's a way of conducting research, and more importantly, it's also an accessible way of presenting research, but fictional. What this means is to allow social research or ethnographic inquiries to construct fictional narratives as opposed to academic prose, often implicated by impenetrable jargon. This is what Wolfgang Iser in 1997 referred to as overstepping, which means bringing empirical reality into literary work. It is also in this context that Robin Clare has brought the material from her well-regarded ethnographic research on corporate greed into a suspense novel called Zombie Seed and the Butterfly Blues, published in 2013. The format of the novel, as opposed to regular academic prose, allows the author to explore more creatively and more lucidly issues such as corporate greed, environmental pollution, and domestic violence. Now, most supporters of social fiction, this kind of fiction, usually opt for this because it allows crucial issues to be discussed among a larger cross-section of the population and in ways that make sense to them. See, I guess there are a few academics in the audience. We know very well that nobody really reads what we write. Of course, we might end up winning awards and all these kind of things, recognition from God-forsaken political leaders and all these kind of things, but nobody really reads what we write. But what happens if you write fiction on the basis of that research? That is more, the same thing has happened to me. Whenever I write in the newspapers, people read the damn things. I write something scholarly, nobody really reads, right? So if you are interested in making an impact, then I think you have to take this kind of attempt at creating fictional narratives based on research fairly seriously. This is what I'm trying to argue. So basically, the point is that if you follow this method, then it allows you to discuss crucial issues among a larger cross-section of population in a way that you understand. So you use the language that is accessible to them. Seen in this sense, social fiction is mostly a matter of narrative motivated by an ideological commitment to communicate matters excavated from research to people beyond limited circles of experts. But we also have to be realistic that not everyone can be a decent fiction writer or poet, right? However, insightful the ethnographic or historical or other kinds of research material he or she has generated. So you might have good researchers who've done decent work, but they may not be able to be decent fiction writers or poets, right? In my mind, however, See, this also doesn't need to be the case. Now, we should not expect, people like me and Susirit and Jagat and whoever else here who are academics to be poets. And that's why I started by saying I'm not a poet. I dabble in poetry. There is a difference, right? So, what am I trying to argue then? Is the question you will have. So one does not have to be a writer of this sort. In my mind, creative expression, when it comes to communication, does not necessarily have to be only fictional or poetic. It can be non-academic journalistic prose too, but based on serious social research and reflection. You read our newspapers, you also read a lot of nonsense, no? But I am not talking about that kind of thing, right? Let your research speak to people in a way that they understand. Now, this is what I have tried to do for many years, masquerading as a writer or a journalist in popular forums in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and India. I have this very strange experience, in the mountains of over the Kathmandu Valley in a place called Hathiban. I just went there with my wife. Absolutely desolate place at that time. Only the two of us were there. I said, I am Sasanka Perera. I have a reservation. This young guy came and said, you are a journalist. No, I said, no, I am an academic. At that time, University of Colombo. Then he goes around and finds this Himal magazine, copy of Himal, published in. He said, friend, see, your name is here. So this guy knew me not because I am an academic, but because I've written an article that he understood. See, so that is the kind of, now that is not just, it was not fiction, but it was non-academic prose, right? And I think this is the kind of thing that actually captures people's attention. On the other hand, fiction as well as poetry that already exists in society can be a resource for social research too. Talking specifically of poetry in social research, Laurel Richardson says that aspects of humanity that social scientists may miss might be revealed in poetry, allowing readers to connect with things deep within themselves. Similarly, Miles Richardson notes that poetry is useful when one is keen to reveal a moment of truth, while Sandra Faulkner argues that a researcher might consider using poetry when prose becomes insufficient to communicate his or her message. Sorry, I lost my notes. Okay. Personally, I have learned quite a lot about the conflict in Kashmir and its impact on local people from the poetry collections of Agha Shahid Ali, such as Memory of Begum Akhtar and The Country Without a Post Office. Some of you may have read these things, in addition to the scholarly work on the same theme I have read. Similarly, my understanding of the Sri Lankan Civil War and its terrible consequences on Tamil people comes from my own research, using conventional methods, reading what other scholars have produced, as well as work of poets such as Rudramurti Cheran, presented in compilations like The Second Sunrise, translated by Lakshmi Holmstrom in 2010, In a Time of Burning, translated by Lakshmi Holmstrom and Sasha Eveling, and You Cannot Turn Away, translated by Chelva Kanaganayagam in 2011. Now, this is merely one example of a poet from many possible examples of this kind. One of the most nuanced readings of the background that led to the 1971 insurrection came to me long time ago from the poetry of Parakrama Kodituakku. Similarly, the poetry in contemporary times, the poetry of Kapila Gamage, Buddhi Galapatti, Lahiru Kitalagama or Kusal Kuruvita and many others who write in Sinhala offer considerably sophisticated insights into the times and contexts in which they lived, which we also share, much better than writers in social sciences, I think. It is also the same, I would say, about Gunadasa Amarasekara. I mean, there is a guy with whom I have had major disagreements politically. All this Jatika Chintanya stuff. But if you look at his this series of novels, short novels, Gamanaka Mula, Gamanaka Madhur, this, that and the other, I think there were 7 or 8. Now, if you want a sense of Sinhala people's migration from the rural sector to the city, and the kind of cultural transformations that took place there, and then them migrating to the West, coming back with all kinds of confusions and so on and so forth, I would recommend to anyone, read Gunadasa Amarasekara. But if you want political enlightenment, don't read. So these are two very different things, right? And I don't think there is a single social science text currently that offers a nuanced enough reflection on the rural to urban migration in Sri Lanka than these novels, right? So, so the question then is, should we not bring their insights into our thinking and writing just because these are fictional? It is not that I could not have done my work without resorting to the works of poets such as Cheran, Jayapalan and others that I just referred to. But I believe reading their work, even in translation, has given me access to a more nuanced understanding of what we might in sociology call the field. Of course, a sociological study might fully focus on what fiction or poetry might reflect on a specific theme too, right? Now, let me give you two very specific examples from Sinhala poetry with which I had some direct involvement. These other things I am referring to because I have read them, I've thought about the works of these poets and so on, but these two collections I am about to refer to, I had a personal involvement. I have in mind Sandarasi Sudusingha's 2021 collection of poems called Gini Vedunu Piyapat, focused quite obsessively on the destruction of the Jaffna Public Library and the guilt over that incident in the mind of a person who was not even born when it happened, and Sujiva Hettitantri's 2019 collection of poetry called Sandeshe Avala Bag Kaputanta Gode. Now, Hettitantri, his verse dealt with poverty, divisive politics, love, nostalgia in living away from home because he teaches sociology in the US somewhere. And also he talks about the interpretation of the past and many other things. I had to write the introduction to both of these poems, and as usual, I was very reluctant on the basis that I am not a poet. But then, some of these are former students, don't listen. So I ended up writing the introductions. In writing these two introductions to both collections, my basic question was, would these collections allow me to treat them as sources to discuss different aspects of Sri Lankan life, history and politics, right? And my response to myself was that they could. In the same way, the works I referred to earlier also could. So, now, it is on that grounds that I try to go into fictions whenever I want to and whenever I can, in a way that I can also talk about society, but much more interesting, right? This is what I was trying to tell you with regard to Gunadasa Amarasekara's work, because it is, politically problematic, particularly his latter stuff, but these things actually gave a certain nuanced introduction to the way in which our society changed. My belief is creative expressions and unorthodox ways of doing things can be brought into any pedagogical and research situation if there is fertile imagination and adequate political will. Let me offer you one personal example from pedagogy In 2022, for the MA course Social Theory 1 at South Asian University, co-taught by my colleague Ravi Kumar and myself, Ravi designed the final exam that allowed for the intersection of selected poetry with the ideas of the three mainstream thinkers whose contributions we had explored in the class. These thinkers were Karl Marx, Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, all late 19th century European thinkers. Now, the exam presented the poems of The Rebel by Qazi Nazrul Islam, Don't Ask Me My Darling, and We Will See by Faiz Ahmad Faiz, and Taj Mahal and the Shadows by Sahir Ludhiwani. All these were 20th century South Asian poets, specifically from Bangladesh, Pakistan and India. Because these poets were talking about religion, rebellion, structural inequalities, solidarity and the processes that created the societies in which we lived, we asked the students to think about elements such as religion, social and political structures, solidarities, social relations and so on that were discussed in class in relation to Marx, Weber and Durkheim in the context of related ideas emerging from the poems and their context, and answer 4 specific questions. I'm not going to read all the questions, but the first question was this. How does religion converse with social structure in these poems? And in what ways can we use sociological theory texts to understand this conversation? See, completely different things. Poetry from the 20th century and social theory, 20th century South Asia, and social theory from 19th century Europe, right? In answering these 4 questions, we gave the students considerable freedom to discuss issues of theory in relation to these poems, their own lives, what they have seen and what they have read. What we attempted was to bring into mainstream social theory class a non-orthodox pedagogical tool informed by poetry but for evaluation. So this is not some joke, right? Everybody had to get marks because you also had to cater to the university system of evaluations, right? The same applies to the use of visual art, visual culture in social research too, even though I have written a lot about it, but I will not discuss this today. The question then is, aren't the themes dealt with selected poems, fictional narratives and visual artworks function as legitimate domains of social research? Aren't these the same thematics that interest sociologists and other practitioners of social sciences and humanities? It is due to these kinds of considerations that my 2017 book, Violence and the Burden of Memory, Remembrance and Erasure in Singular Consciousness, which took 10 to 12 years to research and compile, had an entire chapter on visual arts attempting to disentangle the memories of violence embedded in them. So these are the works of what is now known as the art of the 1990s. This book and my 2016 book, War Zone Tourism in Sri Lanka, Tales from Darker Places in Paradise, has made extensive use of photographs to build their arguments too. These were not mere decorative additions. Without this focus, these works would have remained incomplete in my view, even though the rest of the research followed conventional approaches to social research. And these books are now available here, but otherwise none of them are available in Sri Lanka, except in the Parliament Library. It's a very funny place to have critical books. Nobody reads them there. I had a friend who was the librarian. He told me, Machan, your books are all in the library, and fortunately I can read these because these buggers don't read them. And he was referring to our parliamentarians. This guy was well read in a lot of books, including mine, because they were just left there. But now, Priyanshi, you have them too. Now, what does all this say? This is what I am trying to ask you people. Now, I've given you this whole scheme of things, not necessarily that well connected, but I hope it's at least minimally coherent. But what does all this say? The current situation across social sciences in our country and in the region is marked by institutional and personal conservativeness and non-innovation, further compounded by disruption set in motion by states. In this context, a landmark epistemic break that might openly absorb creative expressions into the existing methodological fold in social sciences and pedagogy of social sciences is not conceivable in the foreseeable future. But even in this dim and uninspiring situation, both individuals and in a few instances, some institutions as well, can achieve much. But to do that, you have to have adequate political determination and intellectual will. Now, this is very unlikely to happen in universities, coming from that background. But Priyanti, my biased opinion is this kind of place, if you get your act together, might just be able to pull it off. So this is my interest in doing this presentation today too. Unlike colleagues squarely located in the midst of the arts-based research discourse, some of whose works I have referred to today, and whose opinions on some matters I value, I am not advocating for a concerted epistemic break privileging creative expressions in social research, in teaching and in publishing to the extent of undermining other valuable and available and more established approaches. So I'm not saying let's bring fiction and poetry, kavi and samaja vidya, that is not what I'm saying, right? But I am also not a fan of generating fiction or poetry from social research just for the sake of it. Computer is driving me nuts today. I don't know what's going on. I think there is a
creative bug.
I know. See, I was trying to say I'm not a fan of generating fiction or poetry from social research for the sake of doing it, though I recognize they have considerable value in specific kinds of research, right? But I do think that forms of art varying from fiction to poetry and different kinds of visual arts do have stories to tell, and it is up to sensible and imaginative research and teachers to make these works speak to us and to make use of creative forms of language to communicate complicate ideas with dynamism. Now see, this is also a fairly serious problem because our writing is utterly boring and generally speaking, now wouldn't you agree with me? The way you write poetry and the way I write my sociology, who will make more headway? I know you will not say it's you, but I would say it is likely to be you, right? Who the hell is going to read my journal articles and so on and so forth, even though we might be talking about the same thing in certain ways, if it's political violence or poverty or whatever, right? Now, okay, let me come back to this whole thing. We need to recognize, I think, that these works might tell their stories in a more nuanced fashion than what conventional social research, methodological and pedagogic approaches would allow us. This is what I'm trying to say. And this is particularly the case in specific situations where these kinds of discourses might have more to offer than pre-existing academic official historical sources or what we can hope to garner from techniques like interviews, case studies, surveys and so on. Now I think if you are looking at political violence of Sri Lanka, if you do not look at our visual culture, then you are going to have a serious problem. your whatever else you do will be marked by a certain sense of poverty, right? If you do not look at poetry coming from Tamil society about the same violence in that part of the world, you will have a fairly serious lapse, because I think those creative forms capture the experience of that time far more subtly than our social science texts, right? I mean, obviously it's much better if you can read the original, but then people like me can't. So it's still better to look at this in translation. And when it comes to Tamil poetry, there are much more translations than when it comes to singular poetry, right, or fiction, because of the diaspora. But I am not discarding any of the formal, taken for granted methodological approaches too. I am simply saying their limitations should be understood, while also working out how those limitations can be addressed by adopting more creative ways, which are less often considered or not considered at all. So this is why I was trying to say that in a university, and since there is at least one or two university colleagues, I mean, you tell me when we discuss whether this is possible, to tell a research methods class, let's bring poetry into this, it's not going to happen, right? Now, in South Asian University, until I was thrown out of there, there was nobody to tell me, right? Because it's a new university, we were the ones who were creating history. So I want to bring poetry into it, I damn well did. But now you can't do it because it's become conventional, right? And no other university in India would do this. It has not. But now I am also, by saying all these things, you might think that this guy is going to, he wants to bring poetry and fiction into social sciences, and this is going to encourage the emergence of a kind of a footloose social sciences. But I am not saying this. That is why I said at the beginning, this is not about Kavi and Samaja Vidya kind of approach is not what I am trying to say. People have tried to do this in this country. It is very, very strange, right? But I am simply suggesting that more creative ways of thinking about research and writing need to be undertaken. Now, how that is, or why that is, or what it is, needs to be discussed, right? My suggestion is simply this, my final suggestion. That is to simply keep our minds open for newer possibilities of social research, pedagogy and communication, while also mastering the conventions of our disciplines that already has things to offer. Now, I am not saying this because I cannot use the more conventional things, right? Now, you need to master these things, including statistics, which I despise. But, I mean, I know when certain kinds of statistical approaches is needed. Since I'm so bad at it, I'll tell my colleagues, see, you need to help me here. But I'm not going to privilege that. That is what I'm trying to say, right? Now, I can't see why statistical approaches to, let's say, poverty cannot be combined with photography and poetry, because that will give you a much fuller picture. Statistics will give you the patterns, and the sense and the feelings will come from the other more creative sources, as long as these creative material have been produced by the people concerned. Now, there was an exhibition at the Lionel Went a few years ago, produced by young kids from the estate sector. I thought they were brilliant photographs. And of course, art critics were saying this is very conventional. So, my point is, so what? They are trying to explain their backgrounds, the context in which they live. Why it's good that it's conventional. So we know this is not supposed to be art, it's supposed to be life, right? Then it becomes the kind of material for my kind of research. Okay, I know I probably have bored you to death, so thank you very much. So I don't know your format, Nishara.
Normally the floor is open to any questions after the end of a talk, and there's no sort of rules as such, except that we want like a vibrant discussion. So So if anyone is interested in going first.
Thanks, Sasanka. Very good. Well, the assumption in your presentation was sort of to bridge these two different worlds. Does the orthodoxy prevent, or is there an orthodoxy that stands in the way in which you're rebelling against? That's my first question. And the second question is, it comes back to this tension between what is objective and what is subjective, because poetry, fiction, all that, certainly celebrates a subjective view and a subjective expression, whereas, social sciences, attempting to be more scientific, has to at least seen as being more objective.
Yeah, obviously, that's, there is an orthodoxy, which one could even say I'm part of that orthodoxy too, at least for a fairly long time. I was trained in that orthodoxy, and I was trained well, I would say. But then I also found that it had this, what I would call lacks, that something had to be done about it, and this took me a long time. I mean, 25 years ago, I wouldn't have told you to think about poetry and so on. I enjoyed poetry and fiction, but not necessarily in a single domain, right? So yes, there is an orthodoxy, and a very colorless orthodoxy at that. So yes, and I could do what I am doing. I could rebel, to use your words, in a city. I couldn't have probably done it as successfully in Colombo, but in Delhi I could see, not because of Delhi, but because that university was new at that time, right? But things have changed. Now, the second question is fairly important too, and that is this whole business about objectivity and subjectivity. See, there was a whole debate about what objectivity and subjectivity means in social sciences, in parts of European and North American social sciences, particularly in anthropology. But that debate didn't come really to our part of the world. So these things were questioned. I mean, statistics are not as objective as we think, isn't it? It depends on what questions you ask and what is the training of the people who ask these questions and what are their own biases, right? So this is something nobody really gives any attention to. So objectivity to me is a fairly important goal, but it doesn't mean that it is the ultimate truth, right? There are other ways, that there are subjective tools you can use to come to a fairly objective answer, right? And I would say that reading these poetry collections that I was referring to about Kashmir, and even on northern and eastern Sri Lanka, I think those things, as non-objective as they are extremely evocative about what the hell was going on in these parts of the world, in a way that actually touched me. So when I was writing one of these books, I forget the names of my own book, this one, War Zone Tourism, this works, War Zone Tourism in Sri Lanka. There was one section that I mean, this is not about the war. This is about tourism into that part of the country, which became very problematic at one point. So I had to explain what happened in the war in order to contextualize tourism. So I asked this question, now do I have to go back to that conventional explanation in sociological terms what happened, or is there another way? So I thought, okay, I am going to quote a poem by Cheran. It was called The History of a Leg or some such thing. I find a brilliant poem about, he's talking about this foot that was severed from its body. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put this poem and this will explain what that war meant. And it is in that context that this tourism will take, right? So that is one, so this is what I'm trying to say now. The research was objective, but then I was using this to contextualize it. And then two other things I did in this book is that we had two phases of war zone tourism. One before the war ended and one after the war ended, right? Now, in both things, I begin with a fictional narrative of somebody who's trying to go to the north and the east to engage in this tourism. Now, I could have given that on the basis of my interviews and so on, which also existed. But I wrote a half a page fictional account. But I didn't say it's fiction. Maybe I did say in the introduction, but I asked colleagues, both in India and Sri Lanka, I said, don't say it's fiction, just let it be. But given the fact that I was orthodox in my own way, I made it possible for readers to understand there is something different in this by italicizing these two things and also separating it with a bunch of stars. So, but it was the opening because it gave the sense of what to expect in that particular phase of tourism, and the rest, based on interviews and photographs and whatnot, created the story. So these are the possibilities. So it's not that I am not talking without context. This is not abstract theoretical kind of thing. It is theoretical too, but then these things, at least I have tried these things. And nobody has taken me to task so far. In this country, because nobody would have read these things, but elsewhere in the world they have. But anyway, I didn't mean to take this much time, but yes, madam. How's the medical faculty?
Okay, yeah, we are in the same area.
Exactly. Yeah.
Throughout your talk, I felt as if I was that proverbial drunk under the lamppost. You know the story?
Yeah, I do know the story.
Because I was trying to find meaning in that area where there was light, the rest of, most of what you were saying was a little on the dark side. We come from the natural sciences and medicine and so forth. So, a lot of the time that you were saying it, I was trying to see, is this sociologist and the poet also equally applicable? Can a doctor, for instance, do a talk of this nature, the doctor and the poet trying to bring fictional narratives into a hardcore science, right? I know lots of physicians have been good creative writers.
Yeah.
But how do you, sociology you can do it because you are talking about the collective human experience, sociological experience, where when it comes to medicine it is more individualized, patient and so on. But then the human condition comes in. So the question is, what would have been a situation where a medical person attempts to do your kind of lecture today?
No, that's I'm very happy you asked this question because I was actually going to dabble in this. Then I thought I'm not going to do it because I'm not an expert. But I just referred to social sciences and natural sciences, and I assumed that medicine and all these kinds of things could be accommodated within it. But see, Sushil, it's like this. Now, I don't think it's as easy even for a sociologist to do this because they think their discipline is scientific. It is the same logic applies, right? But because it deals with language much more closely, there are better options to do it if you want to. Now, I think, I don't have much regard for medical education in general, but I think if you look at the medical faculty school in Colombo, it has also created some very creative people over the years, since the 1960s. It has doctors who has written songs, who perform, and photographers and so on and so forth, at least since the 60s. And it still has this very well-known kind of bias towards music, So now, that means that some of these people have internalized these creative possibilities. Now, Whether it can be brought into the discipline is another matter, right? But I think if you look at the 1950s and see the ways in which not just doctors but social activists and so on and so forth who are trying to explain the consequences of malaria. No, obviously in the 50s we did not have the literacy we had today to write about these things. So, in certain kinds of pereharas organized by temples and whatnot, people were trying to explain the consequences of malaria and how to identify the mosquito, how to stay away from these creatures and so on by enacting these things. Right? These Olubakko kind of dancers, and the mosquitoes were going in the perehara dancing and doing all sorts of things. So now that was science. No, I'm giving you an extreme example, but these things did happen in the 50s. So in the same way, I can't see why certain kinds of things that are related to some aspects of medical sciences cannot be fictionalized or cannot be put in a way that will reach a larger group of people. I'm not referring to your scientific papers, right? What about the distance between our doctors and society? It's a fairly serious thing nowadays. Now, why does that happen? I think the best people to address that would be the doctors. Once recently something a long time ago, I was crossing the road in Panadura, and there was this doctor with his cross on the windshield. He was a bad driver and nearly knocked me down. So, and I, as someone educated in a proper government school, I came up with the choicest signal. I didn't see his damn cross. And you know what he told me? He put the shutter down and said, I'm a doctor. Now that is what I'm talking about. So he got more choices signal from me. But now this is not exactly medicine, but it comes from that education. Now shouldn't medical people, aren't they the best people to address that? But I think in certain ways, Santosha's department has, at least when it started, some of these things were at the forefront of your attention. Now, of course, I lost track. So I don't know whether these things are being done, possibly. But when medical humanities were started in other parts of the world, these two major schools in US, this is also one of the things that they try to do in certain ways, to bring at least humanities to reckon, to have a bearing on the way medicine was practiced, right? But your question will not necessarily come up in the minds of most medical practitioners. That is where the problem is. Because we are not trained to do that. It will not come up in the training in my own area. That's why I said it's not that different. Okay. Yes, madam.
So I have a comment and a question. Comment first.
Whatever.
Okay, so you were just discussing like how can we incorporate this into education and syllabus. As you said, what we're trying to do in the Department of Medical Humanities is to use this as course material. It is not entertainment, it is not stress busters. They have that separate to the curriculum. So we have one thing called understanding patients through art. We use cinema, novels, poetry from Sri Lanka, India,